It was 16th of December 1944, the dawn of a day that would forever be etched into the annals of military history. The German offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun with overwhelming force. The Allies were caught off guard, and amidst the confusion, a small platoon of 18 American soldiers found themselves alone, perched on the ridges of Lanzerath, a tiny village nestled deep within the dense, frost-covered Ardennes Forest in Belgium. Their mission was simple: report, observe, and if possible, delay the enemy's advance. They had no idea that their stand would become a defining moment in the battle. Among them stood Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, a man who had barely completed his training, but now found himself holding the weight of his platoon's survival on his shoulders. Bouck wasn't a battle-hardened officer. He was a farmer from Pennsylvania, drafted into a war far from home. But in the freezing silence of the Ardennes, he felt something awaken inside him, a sense of responsibility, of determination that had never been there before. He knew that in these woods, every decision could mean life or death. The morning sky was gray, the forest quiet, except for the distant rumble of German artillery and the rustling of trees swaying in the wind. The soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division had been caught off guard and scattered. The few who managed to regroup found themselves on the wrong side of the enemy's supply lines. In front of them lay the narrow road that the German advance would use, a road that had to be held. They didn't have enough men or ammunition to stop the German war machine, but they had one thing on their side: surprise. Lieutenant Bouck's men were dug into foxholes, crouching behind trees and rocks, their eyes scanning the white landscape for movement. The cold was unbearable, but it wasn't the cold that they feared now. It was the sound of the enemy. The first German patrol had been spotted just moments ago, and the low murmur of voices echoed through the trees. Bouck could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline surging through him as the reality of the situation began to set in. "Hold your fire until they are in range," he ordered, his voice low but steady. The men nodded, their faces etched with determination and fear. They knew that the next few moments would determine whether they lived or died. The forest seemed to close in around them, the tension thickening the air. The Germans advanced cautiously, unaware that they were walking into an ambush. Bouck's platoon held their breath, waiting for the perfect moment. As the enemy soldiers came into view, he gave the signal. A burst of machine gun fire shattered the stillness, cutting through the German patrol. The first German soldier fell, his rifle clattering to the ground. The others scattered, but it was too late. The Americans had them pinned. For the next few minutes, the two sides exchanged fire, the sound of gunshots and shouting filling the air. The Germans, realizing they were not facing the expected weak resistance, regrouped and tried to flank the Americans. But Bouck and his men were prepared. They knew the terrain, and they knew the Germans would try to advance. With each passing minute, the Americans forced the enemy to slow down, buying time, buying hope. But the battle was only beginning. The first German platoon had been repelled, but Bouck knew that there were more on the way. Tanks were coming. They could already hear the distant rumble of armored vehicles, the mighty panzers, the spearhead of the German offensive. The question now was not whether they could hold the line. It was for how long. "Stay sharp," Bouck barked, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "They'll be back, and this time, they'll bring everything they've got." His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of what was to come. The soldiers looked at one another, their faces pale, their bodies aching from the strain of battle. But they knew what they had to do. They had to hold the line, no matter the cost. Because if they didn't, the road to the heart of Belgium would be open for the Germans to take. As the smoke from the gunfire cleared and the first wave of German soldiers retreated into the woods, Bouck allowed himself a brief moment to assess the situation. His men were still standing, still holding their positions. But the Germans were regrouping, and this time, they were bringing more firepower. The Americans had to prepare for the inevitable push. The battle for Lanzerath Ridge had only just begun, and in that moment, Lieutenant Bouck knew. Whatever happened, they couldn't afford to lose. The cold of the forest was nothing compared to the chill creeping into their hearts. As the rumble of German tanks grew louder, it was no longer just a matter of holding the line. It was a question of survival. Lieutenant Bouck could feel the weight of every decision pressing on him, heavier than the cold, heavier than the exhaustion. The sounds of retreating German forces had faded, but he knew they were regrouping. What they had just experienced was a mere taste of what was coming. The quiet after the firefight was deafening, almost suffocating, as if the entire forest had paused to take a breath, waiting for the next move. He tightened his grip on his rifle and glanced over at his platoon. The faces of his men, the young soldiers who had barely seen battle, were set with determination, but there was a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They were scared. He could see it, though none of them would admit it. This wasn't just some skirmish. The Germans were coming with everything they had, and there was no certainty they could hold. Sergeant Miller, a man who had seen his fair share of combat, walked over to Bouck, his face drawn and pale. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low but steady, "we can't keep this up forever. We've got maybe a few hundred rounds left, and no reinforcements. The Germans will have tanks here by noon. What's our plan?" Bouck met Miller's gaze, searching for any sign of hope. But there was none. His own mind raced, turning over the options. There were no options. They were too far behind enemy lines. They were too few in number. The radio was down. He was cut off from any possible help. It was just him and his men against the might of the 1st SS Panzer Division, and the tanks were coming. "Stay in position," Bouck finally said, his voice hoarse. "We hold. We don't retreat. We don't give them an inch. If they want this road, they'll have to pay for it." But even as he said the words, he felt the unease settle deeper in his chest. Every instinct in him screamed that he was leading his men to a slaughter. Yet retreat wasn't an option. If they ran, they would leave the Germans with an open path to the heart of the Ardennes, and the Allies couldn't afford that. As the day wore on, the platoon took up their positions again, digging deeper into the snow-covered earth. The wind picked up, cutting through their coats, numbing their fingers and faces. But it wasn't the cold that gnawed at their spirits. It was the waiting for something to break. Corporal Harris, a young soldier from Kansas, stood next to Bouck, his face tight with worry. "Lieutenant, how much longer do we hold?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "How long do we keep fighting if there's no chance of winning?" Bouck turned to Harris, his eyes softening for a moment. The boy was barely out of his teens, far from home, thrust into a war he didn't understand. "We fight until we can't," Bouck replied simply. "We don't have a choice. This is our stand." But deep down, Bouck knew the truth. The choice was slipping away from them. He could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. If they held and the Germans broke through, it wouldn't be his death they faced. It would be the death of all his men. And he wasn't sure he could live with that. He was not a soldier by training. He had never been prepared to command in such a situation. As the minutes turned to hours, the tension mounted. The men were running low on rations, their bodies beginning to stiffen from the cold, the constant stress of battle. The thought of the German tanks arriving loomed over them like a dark cloud. The horizon was empty now, but everyone knew the tanks were out there, moving through the trees, advancing slowly but surely. Private Thompson, barely 18 years old, huddled with his fellow soldiers in the trench. He looked at Bouck with a nervous glance. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking, "what if we don't make it? What if they just overwhelm us?" Bouck felt his stomach tighten. The fear in Thompson's voice mirrored the thoughts that had been haunting him all day. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know what to say to a scared boy who had no idea how close he was to the edge. Before Bouck could respond, the ground shook with the first heavy rumble of tank engines. The men looked up in unison. The sound grew louder, closer. A moment later, the roar of the panzers cut through the air. Bouck's heart skipped a beat. The tanks were here. "Get ready," Bouck barked, his voice sharp. "They're coming." The men scrambled into position, fingers shaking as they gripped their rifles. They had no way of stopping a tank with the limited resources they had, but they would do whatever they could. The sound of the tank engines grew louder, deafening. The air seemed to vibrate with each passing second. The first tank emerged from the fog, its silhouette cutting through the white backdrop of the forest. The men held their breath. It was then that Bouck realized something. This wasn't just about holding the road anymore. This wasn't just about slowing the enemy. This was about something bigger. The fate of their mission, the fate of the 106th Infantry Division, even the fate of the war itself. It all depended on this single moment, and the Germans were coming. The tanks rolled forward, their engines thunderous, drowning out all other sound. But in the stillness of the forest, beneath the roar of war, Lieutenant Bouck heard the quietest sound of all, the ticking of time, counting down to their final stand. The forest had grown colder, the air thicker with anticipation. The German tanks, massive, unstoppable machines of war, loomed on the horizon, creeping closer with each passing moment. The earth beneath Buck's feet trembled, vibrating as the first tank emerged from the mist, its silhouette a dark beast against the gray sky. It was a sight the young lieutenant had dreaded since the first rumble reached his ears. Now there was no escaping the inevitable. His heart raced as his mind scrambled for a plan. There was no real way to stop the tanks with what they had. The rifles, the machine guns. They were useless against the steel beast that rumbled closer. The soldiers had no anti-tank weapons, no grenades capable of breaching the thick armor. All they could do was delay, harry the enemy, and hope for a miracle. The men were ready, but even Buck could see the fear in their eyes. They had fought hard, had withstood wave after wave of German soldiers. But this was different. The panzers were the epitome of war's terror, and the soldiers knew that their chances of survival against such an overwhelming force were slim. As the tanks neared, Bouck made the call. "Fall back to the secondary position. Leave the road. We'll use the trees for cover." His voice was firm, but inside his heart was heavy. They were already too far behind enemy lines, with no hope of reinforcements. The odds were impossible, and still, they had to keep fighting. But then, as Bouck turned to signal the retreat, something caught his eye. A movement, swift and deliberate, in the snow-dusted trees to the left. A figure moving too quickly, too carefully. It wasn't German. It was one of his own men. Private Thompson, the young soldier, was darting toward a lone rifle in the snow, hidden by the thick forest. Bouck's blood ran cold. Thompson wasn't retreating. He wasn't following orders. He was running toward the front, toward the tanks, toward certain death. "Thompson!" Bouck shouted, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Get back here, now!" The private hesitated, but only for a moment, before he dropped to his knees, aiming the rifle at the approaching tank. The roar of the engine grew louder, a deep, ominous growl that seemed to shake the very earth. Thompson fired, and the shot was swallowed by the tank's thick armor, harmless. The German tank didn't stop. It kept moving forward, the distance closing with terrifying speed. Buck's heart raced as he shouted again, "Thompson, retreat, now!" But Thompson didn't listen. He was too far gone. The fear had taken hold of him, the desperation to do something, anything, to stop the inevitable. His hand was shaking as he aimed the rifle once more. Bouck could see it in his eyes. The terror, the realization that he had no hope, that he was about to die. The lieutenant's mind raced. He had always been taught that leadership was about making tough choices. But this was beyond anything he had prepared for. Thompson was a good soldier, but in that moment, he had become a liability. His actions were endangering everyone, and the tanks were closing in. If Bouck didn't act, Thompson's reckless defiance could doom them all. "Private Thompson, stop!" Bouck shouted, his voice breaking through the roar of the approaching tank. He rushed toward the young soldier, his boots slipping in the snow, his breath coming in sharp gasps. As Bouck reached him, the tank fired. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the shells screamed through the air and exploded in the trees behind them. Thompson flinched, the blast throwing him off balance, but he didn't move. The tank was so close now that Bouck could see the soldiers inside, their faces hidden behind thick glass. There was no time left. Bouck's hand found Thompson's shoulder, spinning him around. "Get back, soldier!" he ordered, his voice raw with desperation. But Thompson didn't respond. His eyes were wide, frantic, and he was shaking with fear. "I have to do something, sir. I can't just sit here and wait to die." The tank was closer than ever. Bouck had to make a choice. Leave Thompson behind and retreat with his men, or stay and risk everything to save one young soldier. The decision tore at his soul, but the reality was brutal. They couldn't afford to waste time. If Thompson wasn't going to follow orders, he would become a liability that could cost them all their lives. Bouck's grip tightened on Thompson's arm. "You'll die if you stay here," he said, his voice fierce with the weight of command. You're not going to throw your life away for nothing." Thompson hesitated. For a moment it seemed as if he would break free from Buck's grasp and throw himself at the tanks. But then his eyes locked with the lieutenant's. He saw the truth in Buck's eyes. The cold, hard truth that there was nothing left to do. The tanks were here, and their fight had already reached its end. With a broken nod, Thompson lowered the rifle, his shoulders sagging in defeat. The terror that had once burned in his eyes was replaced with the dull realization of hopelessness. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered. Bouck didn't respond. There were no words left. He turned away, pushing Thompson toward safety. But just as they began to move, a loud explosion rocked the ground, shaking the trees, the earth, their very souls. The Germans had fired. The blast sent them both sprawling to the ground, the snow erupting in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, everything was chaos. The world tilted, and Bouck's body was thrown against the earth with the force of the blast. His head slammed into the cold ground, and the world went dark. When he came to, the sound of the tank engines was deafening, closer than ever. Bouck's vision blurred, but his instincts kicked in. He could feel his men moving, preparing for the final stand. He had no time to process the pain in his head or the terror in his chest. He had one mission now: to lead his men to survive, to hold the line as long as they could. But as he stood up, a shadow fell over him. The tank was nearly upon them. The moment of truth had arrived, and Bouck was forced to make a choice: fight and die with his men, or retreat and save whatever was left. The earth shook beneath them, and with it, the final choice was made. In the deafening roar of the German tanks and the bitter wind, there was no escape, no turning back. The time had come for one last stand. The explosion had thrown Bouck to the ground, his body aching, his mind racing to piece together the reality of their situation. He forced himself to his knees, his vision swimming as he saw the outlines of his men, scattered in the snow, struggling to rise from the blast force. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the distant rumble of the German tanks. They were almost upon them, the ground vibrating with each passing moment. "Get up! Get up, damn it!" Bouck barked, shaking off the dizziness as he staggered to his feet. His soldiers were still stunned, some clutching their heads, others dazed from the explosion. But they had no time to recover, no time to think about the pain. "We hold the line!" Bouck's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. His words were fueled by the raw energy of survival, of pure, desperate determination. There was no retreat left for them. The tanks were closing in, the enemy unrelenting. But Bouck knew that if they didn't stand now, it would all be over. The men began to rise, their faces bloodied but resolute. They grabbed their rifles, their machine guns, and took positions behind what little cover the trees and rocks provided. Each soldier knew what had to be done. The tanks would crush them if they didn't make their stand here and now. Bouck's mind was clear now, focused entirely on the task ahead. He couldn't afford to falter. His men were looking to him for leadership, for strength. But deep down, he knew he couldn't promise them survival. He could only promise one thing: they would fight until the end, until their last breath. The sound of the German tanks grew louder. The rumbling engines were deafening as they moved closer, their metal giants unstoppable in their advance. The soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division were close now, their tanks looming on the horizon like a nightmare made real. Then suddenly something broke the sound of the tanks. A figure dashed across the battlefield. A man, a soldier, running toward the front. It was Thompson. Bouck's heart skipped a beat. The young private, the one who had disobeyed orders earlier, had returned to the fight. There was no time for questions, no time for hesitation. Thompson was running toward the tanks, toward the heart of the German assault, and he was holding something. A grenade, a desperate last act of defiance. "Thompson!" Bouck shouted, his voice sharp with alarm. But it was too late. Thompson reached the tank's path and hurled the grenade with everything he had. The explosion was deafening, and for a moment there was nothing but a blinding flash of light and the sickening thud of metal on metal. The tank staggered, its movement halted for just a split second. But it wasn't enough. The tank remained intact, its armor unscathed by the blast. Thompson had sacrificed himself. The explosion had bought them nothing but a brief moment of respite. The tank had not been stopped. The battle was still raging, and the tank was still coming. Bouck felt his blood turn cold. Thompson had given everything, but the enemy was relentless. Bouck's stomach twisted with guilt. He had told his men to hold the line, but at what cost? How many of them would have to die before this nightmare ended? He turned away from the sight of Thompson's sacrifice, his eyes searching the woods for any sign of hope. And then he saw it, the shimmer of movement, the unmistakable silhouette of a second tank coming through the trees. This one was different. It was a smaller, faster vehicle, a reconnaissance tank. Bouck's heart raced. It wasn't much, but it was an opportunity. He gave the order. "Take out that tank. We can't let it get to the ridge." The men sprang into action. The machine guns rattled as they opened fire on the reconnaissance tank. The enemy soldiers inside were firing back, their rifles and machine guns roaring in retaliation. The snow around them erupted into clouds of dust, making it harder to see, harder to aim, but they couldn't afford to miss. Bouck's mind was a blur of orders and movement, his heart pounding as he watched the tanks slowly grind to a halt under their fire. The enemy had misjudged their positions. They hadn't expected the Americans to put up this much of a fight. The tank stalled, its engine sputtering, smoke billowing from the engine block. For a brief, shining moment, Bouck allowed himself to hope. But it was fleeting. The Germans were regrouping, and more tanks were on the way. The men had pushed back one assault, but the battle was far from over. Suddenly, there was a flash. A tank shell fired from the forest edge, slamming into the Americans' position. The explosion tore through the air, sending soldiers flying in every direction. Bouck was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing, the world spinning around him. He looked up, dazed, and saw the soldiers scrambling to cover, trying to avoid the next blast. The tanks had found their range. "Fall back!" Bouck screamed, but the words were lost in the chaos. His men were already retreating, scrambling to escape the oncoming barrage. But it was too late. The tanks were closing in. They had no cover left. The ridge had been breached. Bouck's world narrowed to a single thought. Hold the line, hold until the last. He turned to the remaining soldiers. "We fight until the end," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the roaring fire. "We die together if we have to, but we do not let them take this road." But then something unexpected happened. As the tanks rumbled forward, a faint sound reached Bouck's ears, a sound that had been missing from the battlefield for hours. The unmistakable hum of artillery. It was the sound of salvation. The first American artillery shells came crashing into the German lines, cutting through the snow and debris. The tanks faltered, their movement disrupted by the bombardment. Bouck's heart raced as he realized what had happened. Reinforcements had arrived, but there was no time to celebrate. The battle was still raging. The tanks were still coming. The Germans were not yet broken. But in that moment, Bouck saw a glimmer of hope. His men weren't alone anymore. The ground lay still, as if the forest itself had exhaled a long-held breath. But beneath the silence, the weight of survival settled over them. A victory that would never feel like one. The battle had ended. The roar of the tanks had faded, replaced by the distant sounds of artillery and the soft, rhythmic crackle of radio chatter. The Americans had survived the German onslaught, not unscathed, not without sacrifice, but alive. Lieutenant Bouck stood at the edge of the ridge, his rifle hanging loosely in his hands, his face streaked with dirt and blood. The snow around him was dotted with the fallen, both friend and foe, but the battlefield felt eerily quiet now. The storm of war had passed, but its toll remained. His body ached, every muscle stiff with exhaustion. His mind, however, was a whirlwind of thoughts. He thought of Thompson, the young soldier who had defied orders, who had made a final, desperate charge toward the German tanks. Thompson had given everything, and Bouck couldn't shake the image of him throwing that grenade, his face filled with fear and determination. Thompson had died for the cause, and yet the victory had not come without cost. The lives lost, soldiers who had given everything in the name of duty, weighed heavily on Bouck's heart. "Lieutenant, we made it. We held the line." Sergeant Miller's voice broke through Bouck's thoughts, but there was no joy in his tone. The sergeant's eyes, tired and haunted, scanned the battlefield. The victory felt hollow. Bouck turned to face him. "We did, Sergeant, but at what cost?" Miller didn't answer, but his gaze said everything. There was no triumph here, no celebration. They had held the line, but it hadn't been without sacrifice. Bouck's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the German tanks had retreated, their tracks leaving scars in the snow. The battlefield before him was littered with the remnants of war: broken weapons, spent shell casings, bloodied snow, and beneath it all, the cold weight of the choice they had made: to stand, to fight, to survive. He thought of the decision he had faced when Thompson had disobeyed orders. It had been a choice between saving the men or saving the individual. Bouck had chosen to save the men, but it hadn't been easy. The guilt gnawed at him. Had he made the right choice? Would Thompson have lived if Bouck had acted differently? These questions lingered, unanswered. The burden of leadership was heavy, and Bouck knew it would stay with him long after the war ended. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Bouck gathered his remaining soldiers. There were fewer of them now. Some had been killed in the battle, others wounded and taken away by medics. The casualties were high, but they had done what was needed. They had held the line, delayed the German advance, and bought precious time for the Allied forces to regroup. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. "Gather up the wounded," Bouck ordered, his voice firm despite the weariness that threatened to break through. "We move out in an hour." The soldiers nodded, their movements slow but determined. They were ready to move on, ready to leave the battlefield behind, but none of them would forget the faces of those they had lost. The ghosts of Lanzerath Ridge would stay with them forever. As Bouck walked among his men, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. He knew they looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, but there was nothing he could say to make this victory feel right. They had survived, but it had come at too high a cost. The war would continue, the battles would rage on, but in that moment, Bouck understood something profound. Victory was not always a matter of defeating the enemy. It was about surviving, about enduring. He looked down at his hands, stained with the blood of battle, and for the first time, he realized that he would never be the same. The man who had entered these woods was not the same man who stood now in the cold, staring at the remnants of a war that had stolen so much from him. But survival, he thought, was the only victory worth having. And that was what they had won. Not glory, not medals, but the chance to live, to fight another day. Historical fact: the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge, fought on December 16, 1944, was a critical moment during the opening of the Battle of the Bulge. A small group of 18 American soldiers from the 106th Infantry Division, along with 4 artillery observers, successfully delayed the advance of a 500-strong German force, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division. Though they were eventually overrun, their actions bought invaluable time for the Allies, which ultimately contributed to the successful defense against the German offensive.